Hello, so welcome everyone. We're very, very excited for this webinar, this very special webinar to talk about a very, very important topic with the amount of changes that we will see in this exponential era and the impact of the future of work. So today we have a very, very special session, but first, I want to mention something really, really interesting. In this session, we want you to be to have an active role in this session, not only to be passive, because if you are here, it means that in some way or another, you get attracted by this important topic, and maybe you have awesome insights to share. So we would like to share with you, as you can see, here is a link, a bit.ly link. The idea is we will be testing in this a wiki document, and the idea is Vanessa, can I share my screen for a minute just for this, please? Let me explain you a little bit what's the idea of this, why it's so important your contribution here. So what we want to test here is here is a wiki document with 3 simple rules. The first one is you can edit. We want to get input from you. Please make your contribution neutral. Maybe you will see different point of views in this session. Try to be as neutral as possible. And try, the third pillar is source and credit as needed, support evidence-based journalism. So please try to put the source. Of course, one of the main sources could be our panelists today. So it's good to put them as a source, or if you get something really interesting outside from the internet, it's correct. The idea is to get a very rich document, and let's see what happens if we can get a really interesting document, or that could work as a paper with really interesting insights. As you can see, here are some of the core questions, or some of the main topics that we will be covering today with our moderator, Rob, and of course with our panelists. So here are some of the interesting topics, and your insights is really, really interesting. And let's see what happened with this. This is an experiment. And then please let me introduce you to our moderator today. We have someone really, really interesting. Rob van Alphen. Rob is an active member in our OpenExO community, and one of his posts actually triggered the setup of this webinar, a really interesting post in our platform. He's an ExO coach, consultant, trainer, and ambassador, and spent the past decade helping major brands across Europe and Middle East with their digital strategy. Lately, he was a member of the executive team at the largest luxury retailer in the Middle East. Most recently, however, he launched a school of disruption to educate companies on the impact of emerging technologies and help them navigate a disruptive future. So welcome, Rob, and you're good to go.
Thanks, Edwin. Do we have Salim on here, actually, who I know is one of our 3 guests, but I haven't seen him yet?
He should be joining any minute.
Okay, perfect. Well, in that case, I'll just kick it off. And thanks, by the way, for sharing the information on the wiki document. I have to say that I was adding some information on them myself, which you can find now, but I forgot to add these sources. So for everyone listening, please do follow Edwin's advice and do not be like me myself. But yeah, really looking forward to see what kind of collective brain power and we can be getting out of this document specifically. So yeah, everyone, good morning, good afternoon, evening, maybe in Asia, midnight as well. Happy you guys are all here. I think there's about 500 people registered. Very keen to see how many of you guys will be attending today as well. So yeah, we have 3 key guests. Today, of course, Salim will be joining us shortly. We have Raya Bidshahri, who I had the pleasure of meeting a few times in Dubai myself. And I can really say she's someone who's passionate about learning, right? I think that will be obvious in this webinar. She is a social entrepreneur who promotes STEAM education and a public understanding of science through a number of initiatives and events. One of the things she did was found Awecademy, which is an online platform aiming to bring the, in my case, much needed awe and wonder back to education, basically, and helping students educators develop the critical survival skills for the future. The long-term vision is to create an alternative model to traditional education, so we'll definitely tap into that today. We have Leticia Gasca as well. Welcome, Leticia, who is the CEO of the Skills Agility Lab. She works with organizations to upskill, reskill employees in areas that build agility and innovation. She does a number of things. I'm not going to go through all of them, but among others, she leads Shaping the Future of Work, which is a global project created to understand the needs and perspectives of young people around the future of jobs. And maybe as a side note, she has quite a lot to do with business failure in a positive sense. So among others, she co-founded FuckupNights, which I'm sure many of you guys will be familiar with. This amazing movement, 300 cities, 90 countries already, wrote a book called Surviving Failure as well, and is the executive director at the Failure Institute, which is a think tank devoted to studying basically business failure, which we'll also definitely be tapping into today. Now we have Salim. I'll make the introduction. Not sure when he will be joining, of course, but most of you will probably know him, founding executive director of Singularity University.
Salim is here, by the way.
Okay, hey Salim.
Hi there.
So founding executive director of Singularity University. In a past life, he was leading innovation at Yahoo, but probably most known for the book Exponential Organizations that he wrote, as well as the follow-up Exponential Transformation. And of course, many probably in this community or on this webinar will know him as well as the co-founder of ExO Works and our own OpenExO community. So welcome to you all. And I just want to kick it off as well, so the future of work is such, of course, a vast topic, right? And I'm sure we can all agree that there's been a lot of buzz, right, on this these last years, basically. And each day you see these numerous reports, whether that's online, whether that's at conferences, being thrown at us, really talking about the impact of AI and automation on our own future and on the future of society, of course. Sometimes I'm feeling that this debate is not so much about technology, but a lot more about how we view the world, right? And it's either on this utopian way or very dystopian way. This almost heaven or hell concept. So I actually want to kick it off as well with the first question. And for each of you, very briefly, in a few words, could you describe the first thing that comes in mind when you hear the phrase future of work? Let's kick it off with Salim.
Sure. Welcome, everybody. And sorry I was a minute late. Rob, thank you for navigating us like this. Future of work for me, I think the immediate thought that comes up for me is the fact that this is something fundamental to human existence since the beginning of time, but we have shrunk the amount of time needed to earn a livable wage. 1,000 years ago, we were all spending 20 hours a day in the fields just to put 3 meals on the table. And you didn't know how much you could store in the winter, and you basically worked nonstop just to make that work. And we've shrunk that amount of time. In France, it's illegal to work more than 35 hours a week. And so we're going to keep shrinking that. And I think very soon we get to a word that we flip around. And now we choose to work. We don't want to work. Most of us work hard because we have to. And I think what's going to be interesting, if I go back to your heaven and hell concept, is that's really an abundance versus scarcity mindset. What does work look like in a world of abundance? And I think that's a really interesting topic to get into, whether it's universal basic income or what's the nature of work. Certainly it's ending in the way that we've thought about it for the last few thousands of years.
Mm. And I love the abundance versus scarcity mindset as well. Raya, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so if I had to describe the future of work in one word, I would go with meaningful. There are definitely a lot of valid challenges with the changing nature of work with regards to technological automation. We obviously have to upskill masses of the workforce, and that's a whole other conversation. But another way to reframe it is as technological automation takes over the more monotonous, routine, repetitive tasks, humans are left to do more creative, higher ordered, social, and meaningful tasks. And personally, I'm really excited about that. Another trend that we're seeing is the rise of the imagination age, where imagination and creativity become the primary creators of value in society. So I think that really what we have before us is actually an incredible opportunity. If we are able to get the masses of workers that are being displaced on board with the right skills and the right mindsets, we're actually able to create a wealth of meaning and purpose and abundance for our entire species.
Mm-hmm. And I love that you mentioned mindset, because I feel often as well it has to go beyond the skills narrative, right? Leticia, what are your thoughts?
Well, building on that one, I think when I hear the word future of work, I think about, first of all, the future of purpose. I think that in this new era, we will need to reinvent what purpose is if it is not related with work. And I also think about the fascinating opportunity to reinvent the educational system, to reinvent the workplace in a deep and fundamental way.
Mm-hmm. And you and Raya have definitely a lot in common on those elements. So that's indeed, and Raya, you picked up on a few of these trends, right? And of course, the imagination age is a nice concept around that. So people often talk about technological changes. I know something Salim constantly talks about as well, the accelerated pace of change. Of course, we've got a lot of demographic changes, right? So aging population, longevity projects, trying to add 10, 20, 30, 40 healthy living years to our lives and trying to make 100 years old the new 60, right? We've got, of course, urbanization, migration, etc., shift to the east from a lot of economical standpoints. So all of this taken together, right? I would love to tap in this webinar on three main topics: future work, future workforce, and future workplace. Right, and starting with future work, how do you feel, and Salim, let's start with you again. How do you feel that work will be changing in the next 5 to 10 years? And what's the environment that works will be facing?
So I think there's a statistic that constantly blows my mind, which I think will propagate around the world, which is in the US from 2005 to 2015, in those 10 years, 94% of job growth, new jobs, was the gig economy. Okay, 94% of job creation over the last roughly 10 years in the US was contract, temporary work, the gig economy, not permanent employment. And I think what we're going to see is the basic destruction of the concept of permanent employment. Already we have about 20 job changes per career. The idea that you join some company, work with them for a long time. Now when I meet people that have been at some job for like 25 years, I basically say that qualifies you for a Nobel Prize. I mean, that's just insane in the dedication that you have. So I think that's one, is the sheer granularization of it, right down to Fiverr, where you can get $5 pieces of work done. And so I think the decimation of full-time employment is probably the biggest one, moving to that forces everybody to manage themselves as a brand, as we're now starting to see. And I'd love to tell a really quick story, and then I'll move on.
Yeah,
there's a British blogger called Brown Moses, and he was working, and this is absolutely true, he's working at a ladies' underwear store, okay? And he gets laid off, and he can't find work. And he can't get a job anywhere, except he has a passion for small arms and armaments, and starts tracking the Syrian conflict on what are the rebels using versus the government, and becomes like the world expert in the arms conflict. He's following 500 Twitter followers, or 500 tweets, and 500 YouTube channels of the entire Syrian conflict. And he's the one that breaks the news that chemical weapons were used. And all of a sudden he goes from unemployed underwear ladies shop to a highly paid consultant for the UN and for human rights watch organizations. And because he was following his passion, and he kept going down that route. Now, this is what's possible today, and I think we're going to see more and more of it. That's obviously a very extreme example.
Mm-hmm. And we'll definitely come back on that passion element, same with purpose. which of course are very strictly aligned. Leticia, what are your thoughts on this?
That's so interesting because saying that 94% of new jobs are temporary or part-time is really aligned with the youth perspective on this topic. As you know, I am leading Shaping the Future of Work, a global project created to understand the youth perspective on this topic. The report will be launched in January, but I am super happy to share some key insights that can help answer your question. When asked about the future, almost half of the survey participants across all regions agreed on 4 main aspects of the future of work. One is that people will be able to work remotely and with flexible schedules. Agreed. The second one is that new industries and jobs will be created complementary to technology. This is not big news, but probably it's interesting to see that young people has so much clarity on this. The third one is that there will be fewer jobs that require humans and more jobs that require creativity and other type of soft skills. And also that there will be more entrepreneurship and self-employment. So I think that the future of work, as mentioned, is aligned with most of the new jobs will be temporary, part-time, gig economy. That's not necessarily bad, but we need to rethink the social contract and what will happen with, for instance, the healthcare of all these part-time workers.
Mm-hmm. And that's a nice summary as well. And maybe Raya, often people speak about, okay, the career is changing, right? Because of course we mentioned longevity, adding 20, 30, 40 years to someone's life. And where today life or career is often seen as having 3 life blocks, right? You educate, you basically work, and then you retire and the day after you die, right? That's typically what happens. How do you see this shifting in the next 5, 10 years?
Yeah, so that's a huge problem right now in education. Isn't necessarily the fact that we don't have solutions, it's the mindsets that inhibit the solutions coming into place. So like you just said, there's this mindset that you get the majority of your education in your 20s, maybe through a bachelor's, master's degree, and then you work in that career that you got an education for. Whereas what we actually need is short-term training on an on-demand basis throughout your life as you're constantly changing careers in order to keep up with this emerging workforce. But for that, what you need is to completely throw out the industrial era educational model that we have in place and reinvent a completely new model that is actually relevant in this ever-changing workforce. And as you mentioned, we at Awecademy, we're working with entities like the Dubai Future Foundation to develop the alternative school model. And what we're finding that we have to do is change how people think about education at all levels. So regulators are often the source of the problem, and they need to be educated on opening up regulations for workforce upskilling and for reinventing education. Parents, students, often employers themselves, university admissions. So at all these layers, you need to completely change how people perceive education and align it with the changing nature of work. Otherwise, the whole system falls apart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fully agree. And when you think about also jobs of the future, right? I always feel when you read, and there's just so much written these days, futurists and innovation professionals, it always seems easy to predict which jobs are going to disappear, right? But it's so difficult to predict which jobs are actually coming up and how can you plan for these jobs. So maybe back to Salim first. From your perspective, what are the type of jobs that you definitely, or even concrete examples that you see not existing anymore in, let's say, by 2030? And which are the ones you definitely see a rise of?
It's actually quite hard to gauge that. Because I'll give you a small example. I think what we're seeing as we see automation come along, there's this general panic that all the jobs are going to disappear. And I actually don't believe this at all. What we've seen when we have mass automation or something, we see something else happen. And I'll give 2 examples. If you take, say, Germany, we have automated pretty much all of the factories in Germany. There's almost nobody working on the factory floors because you have robots doing most of the work. And unemployment has not dropped at all. Employment has not dropped. In fact, it's increased because there's so much more work to do in increased efficiency, design thinking, problem solving, etc. Same thing with bank tellers. when we created the ATM machine for the first time, people thought, well, this will be the end of all the bank tellers. What will we do with millions of bank tellers running around without any work? Except what happened was the cost of running a branch dropped very dramatically. The number of the bank branches, all the banks created a ton more branches, and it turns out the number of bank tellers hasn't changed at all, right? And so what we find is when we automate, we increase capacity rather than just shutting down things, because there is so much more that we could do. And I'll give a final example. The classic example in the US is automating truck driving. And there are 3 million truck drivers, mostly in Trump states. So this will be interesting to see how that's dealt with. But when you automate that, what happens to 3 million truck drivers? So I was actually talking to a trucking company and said, you know, how are you going to deal with this? And what are you looking at? And they gave me a crazy answer. They said, if we had the ability, we would hire 1,000 more truck drivers today, because each truck driver, I get about $500,000 a year in revenue. I could hire 1,000. There just aren't enough qualified truck drivers. We cannot wait for automation because it'll allow us to do much more. And so I think that's the underlying false assumption, because our amygdala automatically goes to the, oh my God, all the jobs are gone, when actually what we actually see is not that.
Mm-hmm. And I feel as well personally that there's so much fear mongering going out there, right? I said there's so many popular statistics that are being thrown around, and truthfully, I do this myself sometimes as well, right? WEF saying 75 million jobs disappearing. Well, there's
Right.
more being created. McKinsey saying 800 million jobs. There's a futurist, Thomas Frey, saying 2 billion jobs by 2030. And of course, the media picks these things up, and it's not always how the world is moving in a maybe more progressive or positive way, which I think there's a lot of power in the community to bring these stories in a different perspective to that game as well. Maybe a question related to that, right? So from a job point of view, it is indeed difficult to predict which ones will be appearing, because let's say 10 years ago or 15 years ago, social media managers and SEO managers, etc., drone pilots or podcast hosts, they weren't really existing by then. But from, let's say, a gender perspective, and really keen to hear Raya and Leticia on this as well. I think that's when you see men and women, how they could be impacted differently. There's a bit of a dichotomy that I feel, because on one element, if you look today at skills or industries where you talk about AI and machine learning and deep learning, but also science and technology in general, that there's a massive underrepresentation of women, right? It's about 20%, I believe, in the AI field. Science technology, Raya will definitely know a bit more of that element. But on the other hand, when you think about future skills, where people often talk about EQ, soft skills or foundational skills, this is where women are currently overrepresented. So how do you see this actually evolving in the next decade to come? Raya, let's kick it off with you.
So McKinsey actually did recent research on this, and they released this report called The Impact of Automation on Women, Jobs Lost, Jobs Gained, and Jobs Changed. And it's quite complex, the answer to that, because on one hand, yes, there is already a gender gap. And the threat of automation is even greater to women, because the gap could widen even more if we do not upskill women to move from low-paying jobs to high-paying jobs. And a lot of times, a lot of women do a lot of more clerical, predictive, kind of easily automatable tasks. So they are they are more threatened by this. On the other hand, and the report highlights this, women traditionally tend to be better at some of the things that are difficult to automate, such as social emotional skills, such as human communication, empathy. And so there's an advantage there that women may have with increased automation. And so that's the trends that we see. And personally, there's a lot of work being done to empower women and closing the gap via technology. So the rise of the contingent workforce is a huge advantage for women, because one of the main causes for the gender is actually lack of flexibility in the workforce for mothers. So if you actually do a comparative analysis of working young females who are not mothers against other young men, there isn't that much of a gap. But the gap starts to widen when they start having children. And so what the contingent workforce and the gig economy allows is that women and everyone else has more flexibility. That means they can work from home, they can work at hours that work best from them, from anywhere in the world, for anywhere in the world. So I see that as a huge advantage for closing the gap and improving flexibility for mothers and other, that's the final point.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great perspective. And Leticia, maybe jump in on that as well, quickly.
Sure, yeah. In fact, I was going to mention the McKinsey report as well. For me, it's mind-blowing that 72% of clerical support workers are female. This means that up to 150 million women will have to make a career transition in the next 10 years. I mean, this is massive. And something else that I was really surprised with the Shaping the Future of Work survey is that we asked responders how well prepared they feel for the future. I think that the question was, how well do you think your education prepared you for the future of work in a scale from 0 to 100? The average response was 55. This actually is one of the few things that keep me up at night. And I'm so happy we're having this conversation because, as Raya mentioned, we are standing in a perfect place to do a lot of things to avoid all these dystopian Black Mirror future scenarios.
Mm-hmm. And I think when a survey says 55, it's probably more like 30, I can imagine as well. So maybe moving to the skills of the future as well. What skills, and let's stay with you, Leticia, because of course you have Skills Agility Lab. Do you consider agility as one of the primordial skills to have for the future?
I think that agility is super relevant, and it's also a transversal skill. We can think about learning agility. It's a term that is growing rapidly. We can think about even failing agility, talking about failure. And also thinking agility, thinking about how important it is to have critical thinking, but with this agility component that help us think in a way that is more adaptive to new circumstances. In fact, I would say that the most important skills for the future, and this could be a large debate, probably for another webinar, are learning how to learn, learnability, critical thinking, and agility itself.
I think there's this great quote, right, from Alphen that I know, Salim, you are also often using, saying that, well, the people that will thrive in the future are the ones that can learn, unlearn, and relearn. So do you or add something to that?
Wait, are you asking me?
Salim.
Okay, got it. So
yeah.
I think there's 2 or 3 things here that are really important and resonant. The discussion about how do women participate in this, I think, is a really profound one. The labor liquidity that comes from this new world allows participation now by everybody, which I think is incredibly powerful. It blows my mind that countries that are very patriarchal, half the population is not contributing to the country. You know, this is like insanity. So that's one. Regarding the skills of the future, I think the learning thing, the comment I like to make is, if you think about your best employees and your best team workers and your best colleagues, they're the ones that learn the fastest, right? And they're able to absorb new knowledge, point you to things, route, et cetera, and I think that's what will become very powerful. The whole OpenExO community, as we kind of move forward, it blows my mind how much I'm learning from our key thinkers that are out there, because we have now, you know, almost 3,000 people out doing different things, and the collective learning is unreal. And I think that's going to be the future of the workplace, in a sense, is collaborative communities which learn together in an ecosystem type of a model. And there was a really great comment from Li Feng, which is one of the big decentralized retail networks in the world. 15,000 partners collaborate in the supply chain for clothing via Li Feng. And when you asked, this is from John Hagel, when he was asked, he asked one of them, why are you participating? They said, we learn faster by being part of this network. And so this is really where the future goes. And just to bridge it into the educational side, clearly, this has a huge blow-up factor to our educational systems, to your 3-part life staging clearly is not the way it's going to operate. Education becomes a constant partner, kind of a learning system alongside you, saying you need to get better at this, you need to get better at that. In fact, we're about to partner with an AI company that tracks your skills in real time and tells you, by the way, if you add this piece of knowledge to your portfolio, you'll be X% more employable. And so they can see where the demand for work is and point people to it. And so I think there's some really magical capabilities coming along for how we navigate this. And then the final comment I'll make is it all becomes pointed in the MTP, or what is your passion, what is your massive transformative purpose. We're starting to now hire based on that. How much does the passion of the individual line up with the company's MTP? And if you don't have alignment there, then really, why are you bothering having a conversation? And so we're going to see a lot more of this, I think.
And I will definitely come back on the MTP and the passion in a second. What I like what you were just saying as well is about learning the fastest, right? And I was actually going to jump in with the name John Hagel up until you mentioned him, because he indeed says that lifelong learning will not be enough, right? But it's exponential learning. So the ability to learn faster and faster, because otherwise we can never keep up with the machines. And maybe that's a slight dystopian view laying behind that statement. But maybe Raya, would love to hear from you as well. This lifelong learning and the link with education, how you see that pass?
Yeah, so I mean, it kind of goes back to what I said earlier. In order to have lifelong learning, there's a piece of it that comes with the right mindset, but it also means that we have to stop fragmenting education into these boxes of something that you do for a certificate at the end in order to graduate from a 2 to 4 year program. So in order to complement lifelong learning, education needs to be far more modularized. No degree program should be more than a few months, given the accelerating change what we're going through. It should also be on demand, like just as Salim mentioned, as skills start to develop, you should be able to develop those on demand. I'm very concerned about this because we engage with a lot of students who are below the age of 18, and we're really not teaching them to be lifelong learners. We're not teaching them to be independent learners. Right now, the system has been designed that you learn for consequences. You learn for extrinsic motivations or in order to avoid punishments. So you learn in order to get a better grade, or you learn because your mom would get mad at you if you didn't, or if you want to get into university. But lifelong learning only becomes effective if you're intrinsically motivated to improve yourself, if you have a growth mindset, if you want to keep upskilling and expanding your portfolio. But because we're not raising children with those incentive structures, it's a huge challenge to expect them to switch mindsets when those ways of thinking have been embedded into them. So for instance, we saw this with the MOOCs. They had a 95% drop-off rate. Most people who started a course didn't finish it. And really the main reason for that is just because most people aren't raised to learn in an environment where the only true incentive is their own motivation. So again, I think this goes way back into our K-12 education system and restructuring it in order to incentivize inquiry-based techniques where the students have autonomy into why they learn and how they learn from a very young age in order to complement lifelong learning later on in life.
Mm-hmm. And you picked up on something interesting, and Salim hinted to that as well, right? And once I heard someone say that people need to be the CEO of themselves, right? It's no longer the top-down approach, it's always bottom-up, and meaning that we should focus less on how do we transfer knowledge and more on how can we build that ability to learn for ourselves, right? And Leticia, well, Raya, of course, you mentioned growth mindset. I know, Leticia, that's something you often speak about as well. Can you tell a bit, in the survey you mentioned that people do not feel prepared. So how could we go about, what are steps that we can be taking to have them prepared for this uncertain future?
Well, there are many challenges. Probably one of the biggest is actually to re-educate, like retrain the trainers. But I feel that there are like 3 key things that we can start doing right now, and that all organizations should be doing. The first one is to embrace change. The world is going to change with us or without us, so it's better to embrace change and be part of it. The second one is to embrace lifelong learning. That's key. And the third one, especially for large organizations, is to lead with example. If the C-level is not embracing lifelong learning, you will never expect that the rest of the organization embraces lifelong learning. And also to think that the best way to predict the future is to create the future. And that's what I like about saying that we are the CEOs of our own life. And I would say that those are key elements: embracing change, embracing lifelong learning, and leading with example.
Mm-hmm. And when speaking about leading with example, and that's a great point, right? Because people indeed they are in that mindset of the three-phase life. They need to move away from that to not be left behind, of course. But most organizations, at least the ones I've worked with in the Middle East or in Europe, are not at all structured to handle that, right? And HR is often a blocking factor. And what I just mentioned, the top-down approach will not suffice, right? So would be great to hear as well. So leadership, right? We talked about skills for the individuals that will be key, having this growth mindset. I assume that many of these will be transferable to leaders of future organizations. But what other skills does a leader of the future need? Salim?
So that's a big one. There's a whole bunch that we could pick out here, but I'll go with a few. Obviously, sticking with the purpose-driven and holding the purpose of the organization is key. I think number two is the best definition I've ever heard of leadership is that you're there to serve the potential of the people around you. And then you put yourself in the servant leadership kind of a model. And if you're always looking out for somebody else's potential, everybody wins and you win. And that's the most profound way of, I think, of trying to be a leader. I think a third is having a lot of courage in the world today. It's really easy today to stand by the wayside, not say something, etc. And having the courage to speak out is something important. I'll stand up in front of the oil and gas industry and just go, "I'm sorry, you're toast," and just live with it and let's move on. And it's really important to be able to say that, especially in a world that's changing so fast. The few of us that have some sense of where it's going have to be able to stand up and go, "This is what's happening." And we have a lot of moral failure around leadership today, as witnessed by many of our political leaders. And I think we need to restore that. So I think that's a part of leadership that's, we don't talk about that much, but it's really, really important. And I'll tell a quick story here. We had, anyway, I'm going to skip it. It's going to take too long. But just to suffice, we have, those characteristics of listening. The obvious ones are listening and servant leadership and so on. But I think holding the purpose and being true to it is something that's going to be very critical in the future.
Mm-hmm. And I love indeed serving the people, right? I typically say as well that as a leader, helping humans adapt is basically the number one job, of course. And let's move on to that purpose a bit, right? So people say indeed, if most of our jobs are automated, if creativity plays a much bigger role in our future job, if we can still call it a job, how do we as individuals or how as organizations can we help individuals identify our true purpose, right, and our true passion? Raya, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, so a lot of young people often ask me this. They're very frustrated because everyone tells them, find your passion, find your purpose, but no one actually shows them how to do so. Mm-hmm. So there's a couple of frameworks we try to do with our students at Awecademy. We actually do the Massive Transformative Purpose framework with them, which is often very effective. But another one we do is this Japanese concept called Ikigai. And for those of you who haven't heard of it, the Ikigai framework is all about, essentially what you're good at, what the world needs, what you can get paid for, and what you enjoy, what you love doing. And there's kind of further details about each of those things and intersections of those things that you can go through iterations of in order to find your Ikigai, your purpose or reason for being. So I think what we need more is to, and this is something that we need to do a lot more of, generally speaking, is developing frameworks, teaching frameworks that help with these kind of introspective understandings. We tell people find your purpose, but how? We tell people you need to be emotional intelligence, but how? So breaking those and actually embedding them into curriculum and actionable items and actionable lesson plans that can actually guide students, or any students, and by students I mean young students, people in professional development, kind of guiding them through the process is key, because otherwise it's just some fluffy word that we use every now and then.
Mm-hmm. Do you actually have any great examples of, I'm sure there's many students listening to this call as well, any great examples of educational institutes trying to implement this and helping people indeed navigate that future by identifying purpose and passion, besides Awecademy, of course?
So I'm a huge fan of the School of Life. They're not a traditional institute or educational organization, but they have a lot of amazing content and resources on life skills. So they have lots of videos, cards, books, and they do a lot of workshops and camps and things in London and a few stations around the world. And I think they have an amazing approach and philosophy on developing emotional intelligence, everything from how to cope with anxiety all the way down to how to build meaningful tribes and relationships and find purpose. So I think the resources are really worth checking out.
Mm-hmm. I'll definitely look into those. Leticia, you work with a lot of organizations. How can you as an organization connect people with their purpose? Have you got any good experience or examples of this?
In fact, when I was listening to Raya, I was thinking that probably for the past 100 years, we have been doing something very problematic as society, that is linking purpose only with work, with job. And I think that purpose should go beyond that, especially in this future where we're going to live 100 years and probably for the last 20 years of our lives, we're not going to be working, or yes, we don't know yet. So purpose should go beyond that. And something that I have learned is that embracing failure is a way to find purpose, and especially failing mindfully. What do I mean by failing mindfully? Well, I have a TED talk on that. But what I try to say when I talk about failing mindfully is that you should be aware of the lessons learned. This is a great way to build knowledge for the future. And I think that this is important because if the world is changing really fast, in order to adapt, organizations should move at the same pace. And in the process of rapidly adapting to change, many things will break, many initiatives will fail, and that's part of the adaptation process. I think that our focus should not be on failing fast. Failing fast can be actually a bad idea in some contexts. Our focus should be on failing mindfully, being aware of the impact of that failure and being aware of the lessons learned.
Mm-hmm. That's a great concept, indeed. And so we've been talking a bit about, okay, what does future work look like? So future jobs, the future workforce and skills. We talked a bit about organization and leadership. And I know, Salim, you've been working with so many organizations around the world. Would love to hear from you. Who are some of these things that are preparing them for this that uncertain future, that are also building this future-ready culture?
Yeah, it's of the hundreds of organizations that we've dealt with, the number of people that are doing it properly, I would put on the fingers of one hand. And actually, there's a few, you think about education, right, which is really where the government kind of helps. It's desperately out of date, and you can't easily update an institution like that. You've got legacy thinking, you've got unions, teachers unions, you have regulatory, the accreditation process is a mess. I'll use the example of, I think it's starting to crack, and I'll use the example of GitHub, where which you can rate other people's code, and people can give me like a Yelp type of a review on my software. And it's what's fascinating today is your salary as a software developer in Silicon Valley today has zero bearing on what university you went to, what grades you got, what degree you got. It's 100%. What is your GitHub rating? An open, transparent meritocracy has now replaced the credential giving of a centralized organization, right? And which means the value of a computer science degree just went to zero. Because I can now get credentialed by my peers in terms of, and much more accurately as to what's going on. What happens when we apply that to doctors and lawyers and accountants and so on? It's going to be really fascinating to see. I think the organizations that take this on early will win quickly. We've been talking to, for example, Ernst & Young has a micro-credentialing system where you can now take 3-4 hour courses and get a micro credential on this little thing, which I think is a general guide. Overall, we're really, really bad at it. And really, government doesn't help, and the private sector or big companies don't help. It's really up to the gumption of the individual. And I think if I had to put one skill that the general population could leverage more and more, it would be just gumption, just initiative, grit, determination on if something's not working. This is why the passion comes in, and I know you'll get to it, so I won't touch it again here, but it's the thing that gets you excited about doing the work. When I think about the concept of work, I hate the word because it's a negative word, right? It's what, rather than what I'm working on, what am I occupying myself with, is I think a better framing of it. Why would I get up at 6 a.m. in the morning? That is the thing that is where I'm going to put my most effort. And we don't have an easy ability in traditional society, especially as we transition from the industrial economy to an information-based economy. I was asked to speak last week at a big conference on the fourth industrial revolution, and I hate the term because it's not an industrial revolution, and it's not fourth, and it's not even a revolution. So, you know, we get into wrong labels a lot, and how do we deal with that? I think following your passion to drive the future of some domain or other is where the future of all activity will occur.
Mm-hmm. I agree, and indeed these terms like industrial revolution, they very narrow also the view we have on topics like indeed the future of work. And I want to move to or involve our live audience as well, also for the sake of time. We have Giovanni who asked a question, a few questions actually. I believe he first refers to the World Economic Forum report, saying that about 70 million jobs will be destroyed, while at the same time 130 million jobs will be created. So how much time will we have as a generation to reskill ourselves? Let's start with this one. Raya, any points?
So to be honest, I'm not entirely sure of how much time that we have. I do know that the pace at which we're changing is just not enough. From my experience, speaking to regulators, speaking to, you know, especially in the education space, speaking at all different levels to people, there is a desperate lack of a sense of urgency. Everyone you speak to says, oh, it'll happen within 5 or 10 years. And then you have millions and millions of students graduating every year with completely outdated degrees and completely outdated pieces of knowledge. So I don't know the exact number, but I would say we're not changing fast enough. And I think that there's a desperate need. I mean, I personally don't like to fearmonger or scare people, but I definitely think we need a sense of urgency and drive at all levels to start moving things along much quicker than we are right now.
Mm-hmm. And there was a second part to this question as well, maybe Leticia, saying that certain demographics and people, for example, those with IQ limitations, what's going to happen with them and how can we not have them left behind?
Oh, that's a really big one. In fact, I read the question and I was wondering, oh, that's a really big question. Who will answer that? I hope that the future of work will be more inclusive. I think that that's one of the good things that technology has brought to our life. Some people that have physical limitations to, for instance, to move, they can start like regaining movement with exoskeletons, or so communication. People that can't speak can start communicating in different ways. I think that the key is how to use this technology to really build a world that is more inclusive and prosperous. I think that we don't have the final answers yet, but I think that technology and human creativity will provide some good ideas on how to be more inclusive.
Mm-hmm. And I think as well, the gig economy itself, of course, definitely will be in favor of people with such physical limitations as well, of course. I want to quickly jump a bit to the ecosystem, right? So, of course, we talked a bit about organizations specifically, but and education with also Raya's point of view. So, Salim, you've been traveling the world these last months, talking to governments in, Thailand, India, some parts in Africa, I believe, as well, and probably so many other areas in the world. On one end, I would love to hear who you consider best in class that is preparing the nation for this future, but also how do you feel that government should be taking up their role?
Yeah, I think government needs to step up to a huge level, because they're really not serving the countries. And if I think about who's doing it well versus badly, it's hard to see who's doing it well at all. And I'll give you the smallest example. A few years ago, I was with the Prime Minister of Malaysia, and they launched a new university, a next generation cutting edge university. And they wanted to give every student a headset, a neural headset during class, so they could track what was the retention of the students in real time, right? Amazing idea, except the teachers freaked out and said, we can't have that. That would be an indicator of how well we're teaching or not, and you don't want that live in the classroom. And so they literally killed it, and it couldn't get passed. And I think government needs to take real leadership in here and say, we're going to do things in a particular way going forward, no matter what. And it's going to be for these objectives around education. It has to be open, it has to be transparent, and it doesn't matter what you want, how do you deal with it? I think it really starts with a transformation in education, then leading to it. Right now, we're retrofitting education into our existing lives to deal with this new phenomena of what do I need, what work do I want to do, and how do I want to skill myself? And people are just picking it up and doing themselves, right? Which I think is going to be, which speaks to the passion and speaks to the, I love the word tenacity that I saw in the thread. I think that's a great way of framing it. But right now, when I see what government is doing, at the very least, the accreditation system at universities and the mechanism by which we're granting degrees is just desperately out of date. And I don't see any governments stepping up to take leadership and saying, what should the policy be?
Mm-hmm. And I think as well, a big issue, of course, with the government is that it's so slow, and to change a rule or change a law is going to take years, of course, which we will not have, and we'll have even less time in the years to come as well.
Yeah, I think what's going to happen is the real world will route around it completely, and then we'll go, oh, okay, what do we need to do? And we'll have to reinvent policy in a completely different way.
Mm-hmm. Maybe staying with government as well. They will need to create this flexible social support system, right? Because if you look now, we talked all about gig economy. It's going to be, it is, and it's going to be even a bigger part of work in general. But if you look at most governments, I'm in Belgium for the moment, government is probably equally bad as in most countries around the world. But there's a lack of advantages and full employees in the 9-to-5 jobs are so much more benefited than, for example, freelancers, right, or gig economy workers. Raya or Leticia, do you guys have any great examples on well, either where you see this being tackled differently, or how you see this being tackled in the years to come?
I think so with regards to
Raya, let's go first.
Sorry, Raya, go for it.
Go ahead. Okay, I was going to say that I think that like this exercise of rethinking the social contract, it's something that is still going on. I think that we don't have final answers yet. There are some experiments. For instance, in Brooklyn, in New York, there is the Freelancers Hub, where basically they are trying to build this community of freelancers and gig workers and rethink how should they build their savings for retirement, how should they take care of their own health or buy their health insurance. And I think that that's a good point to get started, but we still need a lot of things to do. To be honest, I'm super concerned to see that most people from my generation are not saving for retirement. And I don't know what is going to happen with us when we are 70 or 80 years old. But yeah, we need, and I think that we need to be part of this conversation of rethinking the social contract. I don't know if young people have this sense of urgency that we must be talking about this in a really serious way.
Mm-hmm. And definitely pension is a big piece, right? Definitely if you're going to be working 30 years longer. Raya, what were you going to add on this?
Yes, so with the context of education and government, I would argue that the ones that do this well are actually countries that don't have a lot of hefty regulations around education. So in a lot of countries, its education is a heavily regulated field, and the kind of checkboxes that you have to tick off before you're a recognized education provider or an accredited education provider are very traditional. It includes things like teaching by subjects, having a standardized test, making sure that you have X amount of students at X amount of times. And it's essentially the entire regulatory framework is designed for the industrial era models. It's obviously outdated for completely alternative models. But in countries where there aren't a lot of regulations, especially for private schools, Canada is an excellent example of this. The very basic minimums to be recognized, to be given permission to do education, is you have to have the X number of students, some sort of a curriculum that the school adopts, and some sort of testing. There's like 5 bare minimum criteria. And it's very similar in many states in the US as well. And in these places, what you're seeing is alternative schools popping out. These are often micro schools that are taking a radical approach to education. They're not teaching by subjects. They're testing through portfolio-based assessments, project-based assessments. They're doing studio-based classrooms where students are building things all day, or inquiry Montessori schools. And those countries are seeing those micro experiments start to pop up. Whereas in countries where it's heavily regulated, the experimentation is just not allowed because it's literally illegal to do a model of education that is completely different from the status quo. So I would argue the countries that are actually not regulating it at all are the ones that are getting it right.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I think as well, you see the East popping up so much more, of course, these and the coming years as well. Maybe a quick question still from the chat, Salim, for you. I know you talk a lot about UBI, right? Universal Basic Income. I see a correct here saying if you work, maybe X years more, doesn't UBI mean that we will no longer need a pension? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. What happens is, we've seen 14 major experiments on UBI run around the world, and only 3 have been done properly as a true UBI. Like the Finland one that failed was a terrible example. It wasn't at all universal. It wasn't basic, and it wasn't even income. So it didn't quite work. But the 3 that we have seen, and a number of the others, are staggeringly successful. And the trick is to deliver enough money that somebody can survive but not be happy. And we found that entrepreneurship explodes. People are having that bottom 2 layers of Maslow's hierarchy covered gives people unbelievable peace of mind and security. It's a disaster, say in the US or other places. What was the statistic I heard, that 40% of the US cannot put $400 together for an emergency? It's just the most ridiculous concept in the richest country in the world. And so we have to go to that model. And at least for once, Andrew Yang, who's one of the presidential candidates, is actually talking about it in a meaningful way. And so it's at least raising the issue. And if you run it right, then you don't need a pension, because over time your money needs drop as well. And therefore, you shouldn't need that much. Now, on the other hand, people are going to be living longer. So how do we deal with that? But I'm a massive believer in it. And just because of the hard data of how well it's worked in the past.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think UBI as well, right? It should give you a foundation and not this great or amazing life, of course, because otherwise you're going to lose that passion. We have a few minutes left, so I'd love to actually end with one action for our audience from each of you. So in the next 100 days, right, what should you recommend to them that they should be doing to better prepare themselves for the future? Raya, let's kick it off with you.
I would say develop the soft skills. I know that's a recurring trend that has come up, to actually really focus on the things like critical thinking, problem solving, communication, actually focus on the soft skills. I think most people, their immediate inclination is to focus on technical or hard skills. And why that is important, I think the soft skills can be a huge distinguishing factor in the workforce.
Perfect. Leticia?
I would invite people to ask themselves 2 questions. The first one is, which new skill should I acquire? And the second one is, which skill that I already have should update or probably reinforce? And in general terms, I would invite people to embrace change, to learn critical thinking. I am convinced that solving complex problems is more important now than ever.
Fully agree. And Salim, and I'm also going to give you the final minutes to close up the webinar.
Yeah, so first of all, I want to thank you, all of you, for participating and just bringing this topic to light. This is probably the most important conversation that's happening in the world today, because it's bringing together the issues with education, legacy thinking, where the world is going. You know, we could spend 3 days on each of these, right? And so it's great to at least trigger the conversation. But I think the comments from both Raya and Leticia were super important in bringing all of this to the front. If you look at where the complexity that we have to deal with, we have life extension coming along. We have the work as a classic employment structure disappearing. We have the metabolism of the world is accelerating very rapidly. The John Perry, John Seeley Brown, and John Hagel often quote this idea that a skill used to last you about 30 years, and now the half-life of a skill is about 5 years, right? And so if you're a web developer, you have to update your skills every year pretty much. So this has to transform. And it's a huge indictment on our society that we don't know how to match this with a new conversation on the social contract, or have no ability to update our educational systems, and no ability to really deal with the social contract and the other pressures on it. And I think what's going to see happen over the next, say, 5-10 years is a fundamental breakup and disintegration of that. And it'll force us to rethink that. There may be a few governments. I'm starting to have some success in talking to presidents, prime ministers, in saying, let's work out the social contract and the future of that now. And maybe that's another discussion we could have as a group, is what is the future of the social contract and what does that look like? And how do we deal with that? Because that part of it will become really critical going forward. But clearly the old structures don't work at all. And all the institutions, if you've heard me speak, you've heard me say that every institution that we used to run the world doesn't work in this world that's going forward. And so we have to rethink it from the ground up.
There's indeed a lot of work to be done. And I think as well, future of work is such a broad topic, and we touched upon a few of these elements, but would it be amazing to go in a bit more depth on some of these, including the social contracts.
Future of work. How's that for a great point?
Amazing.
Sorry.
But in the meantime, I really want to thank Salim, Leticia, and Raya for joining us today as our guests on this webinar, and as well as the audience, of course. So stay tuned in, I would say, for coming webinars, definitely on similar topics. And for now, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of you.
All right. Bye, folks.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
See you guys later.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Bye.